Coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline, Hamas weakened as the IDF continues pounding in Gaza, and Yahya Sinwar asks for assurances he won't be killed. Plus, analysis on U.S. politics and Israel's war for existence, and how Iran's current regime controls the free world through terror and has lost the support of the Iranian people. And remembering Theodor Herzl. All this and more on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Julie Stahl. As the Israel-Hamas war enters day 322, ceasefire negotiations continue. The IDF continues pounding Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel buries the bodies of hostages recovered this week. Take a look.
Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has reportedly added a new demand to ceasefire negotiations: his own survival. An Egyptian official told Israeli media that Sinwar wants assurances he won't be killed, despite previously stating he'd be proud to die fighting Israel. This as cracks may be forming in Palestinian support for the terror leader. On Tuesday, a Gazan woman interrupted a live Al Jazeera English broadcast shouting, "May Allah curse you, Sinwar and Hamas." She was immediately hauled away by an unidentified man. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists on maintaining an IDF presence along the Philadelphia corridor at the Gaza-Egypt border. In a phone call Wednesday, President Biden reportedly pressuring Netanyahu to soften his stance to help get a ceasefire deal. But with the IDF having found and destroyed 150 tunnels there, Israel believes it must guard the corridor to permanently end Hamas threats.
We are prepared for any scenario, both in defense and attack.
Tehran claims that their delay in this massive response that they've promised for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh is part of their strategy for punishing Israel, but Israelis remain largely unfazed. The delay in Iran's execution of this attack has caused a lot of Israelis to just engage in a sort of cautious optimism that perhaps the attack won't be coming at all. Nevertheless, some are continuing to prepare, while others are just going about their daily lives. As the war continues, the outgoing head of the Israeli military intelligence gave an address about the October 7th intelligence failure.
On that Sabbath, we failed the most important mission we're entrusted with, giving a war warning. The ultimate responsibility for the failure of the intelligence division rests with me.
As Israel deals with the aftermath of the October 7 attacks and still faces threats on all sides, the United Nations takes little notice. Israeli Ambassador Gilad Erdan criticized a new UN exhibit that highlights global victims of terror, but omits any mention of Israeli Jews or the October 7th attack.
There's not a single mention of any attack carried out by Palestinians against Israelis. We are about to mark 1 year since the massacre and the largest terrorist attack against Jews and Israelis since the Holocaust. Yet the UN does not think it needs to be displayed on its walls.
Chuck Holton, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Israeli media report Hamas has decided to target Israelis abroad in its bid to avenge the killing of its top leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in Iran. That's because it apparently has little ability left to strike Israel directly from Gaza after the pounding it's taken over the last 10 months from the IDF. In the past, Hamas has largely failed at its attempts at such terror attacks overseas since its founding in 1987. In Israel, mourners are burying the bodies of 6 hostages recovered this week in Gaza. Yoram Metzger from Kibbutz Nir Oz, one of the hardest-hit communities, and Yagev Bukshtav from Kibbutz Nirim were laid to rest in their communities, which are still evacuated. Forensic experts say evidence shows all 6 were shot, and initial findings suggest their captors in Gaza murdered them, but the findings are just preliminary.
We have no idea what you went through there. You do not deserve to end your life this way. In what world is a mother supposed to think that the nightmare will end when her son is returned for burial? In what world does a mother have to thank for the return of her son who was abandoned and murdered?
Israel is keeping up its attacks on both Hamas and Hezbollah as it fights to defeat the terror groups backed by Iran. Israel launched extensive strikes against Hezbollah at different locations in southern Lebanon this week. In Gaza, the IDF says its troops killed some 50 terrorists in just one day in Rafah this week. It also lost a 19-year-old sergeant, the 336th Israeli soldier to die in the Gaza war. Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, says all the bloodshed can end as soon as Hamas is defeated or surrenders.
The future for Gaza will begin when Hamas will be eradicated. It's on the way. It's happening. Once Hamas will be eradicated, we can start speak about reconstruction and building a future for the people of Gaza.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem. Coming up, political developments in the U.S. and how they relate to Israel's fight for existence. I'm joined now by Middle East analyst John Woggy. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've had plenty here to cover with Israel and the war, but you've also been watching the Democratic Convention in Chicago. So what's caught your attention?
Well, off the bat, the first thing that caught my attention, obviously, was the beginning of the convention when you had a threat of 100,000 protesters in the street. It didn't ever approach that number, but there were still a lot of pro-Hamas, anti-Israel protesters outside the convention center, and inside there was a different message coming out from the leadership of the party. And so you have this split. And it was reflected the first night in Joe Biden's speech on Monday to the convention when he went off script and said, these demonstrators outside, they have a point. Well, what's the point? Their point is they want an arms embargo on Israel. They want Israel not to function in the way they have in Gaza or in the north. They basically want Israel muzzled, and they want the United States to make sure that happens. So any president of the United States would naturally have to kowtow to that. So it was, and what happened as a result of that was that Biden himself had to acknowledge that this is a representative of a significant portion of the Democratic base. Wow. So going forward, that's a big issue from now till November.
It's a huge issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there were reports that some Jewish groups had to meet in secret at the Democratic Convention for the first time. That's shocking.
It is shocking. It's shocking for several reasons, one of which is Democrats tend to vote almost 3/4 for Jews vote Democratic in almost 3/4 of the vote each presidential election. Goes up from there, goes down from there. Mm-hmm. But that's about the number they get. And so they're used to having an open field wherever the convention is held. It's like you have Jewish groups meeting here and here, this side of the city. And this time, they actually had to announce where they were meeting shortly before they actually met. They had to go through magnetometers or some sort of metal detector. They had to show ID to let them know who you are. And even then, there was one group that was basically accosted by pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrators and not only ridiculed, but basically threatened. So this was something, I know that you've probably heard of and seen Abe Foxman, who for decades was the head of the Anti-Defamation League, and he would come here for interviews and we'd interview him in the States. This is what he tweeted just recently. After 50 years of fighting anti-Semitism in America, I could not imagine a time Jews would have to meet in secret locations in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. So when it goes that high in the Jewish leadership of the Jewish organizations, you know there's a problem.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
We're talking about the United States.
Right.
So it is shocking. Now, what are the Israel concerns among Jews and Christians about Kamala Harris taking over for Biden at the top of the ticket?
Well, For one thing, what's she been in? She's been the Democratic nominee for a month. Is that what it is? And so you have Joe Biden, who may have diverted here and there on different issues, but even, Prime Minister Netanyahu would give him a hug, say, my friend Joe of 40 years and all that. Kamala's an unknown quality. You don't know where she's going to come from. She certainly leans to the more progressive side of the Democratic Party base. And Biden already, with his team, has been putting extreme pressure on Israel. So the chances are that she's going to appeal to the leftward base to the greatest extent possible in order to get votes in states like Michigan and other key swing states. And so she may become more anti-Israel, not only in her rhetoric, but if she were to become president, in her policy. And that's what Jewish voters in America and Israelis have to take into consideration between now and Election Day.
Absolutely. Now, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been to the Middle East time after time. He gets a lot of press when he's here.
Boy, does he.
Pushing this ceasefire deal that seems to be like almost dead in the water. And why? They believe in the administration that this is the only way that a wider war with Hezbollah and with Iran is going to be averted. And so it's amazed me how far they've gone with it. I mean, now you've got the situation where Sinwar himself is saying, I don't want to die, I want to live, and that's another condition. And it's already, at a dead-end point, and yet they keep trying to revive it. And I think that it's just, they're going to continue to pursue that policy until somebody moves it off dead center. That could be from an actual attack by Iran, an attack by Hamas either within Israel or somewhere outside of Israel. But something's going to move it off dead center. Maybe a preemptive Israeli strike somewhere. We don't know. But they'll keep pushing this as long as they can. Yeah, and we haven't really seen any fruit from it, have we?
No.
Well, John Wogge, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Julie.
Up next, holding on to power while support from the people shrinks. How long can it last? The guest in our next report describes Iran's current regime as blackmailers, holding the free world hostage through terrorism. And according to him, the regime's hold on power is weakening. He spoke with Gary Lane on his news program, Global Lane.
Avoiding a bigger war in the Middle East. The United States is warning Iran against escalating the conflict with Israel. Has U.S. Middle East policy led to this moment? And what approach is more likely to help cooler heads prevail? Well, joining us is Dr. Majid Sadegpour. He's Iranian-American human rights activist and political director of the Organization of Iranian American Communities. Dr. Sadegpour, it's good to have you with us. Iran's blaming the United States. They call us the Great Satan, of course, for supporting Israel in its war with Hamas. Iran claims that Israel would never have taken that risk of assassinating Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh if the U.S. hadn't provided the IDF with weapons. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the regime in Iran has been at war with humanity since its inception. Let me get back to the very early part of the 1980s when the regime in Iran began persecution of the Iranian people and essentially waged war on the people of Iran that has continued to this day. The carnage that you see outside of Iran, particularly in the Middle East at the moment, is really part and parcel of two things. One, a strategic framework built by the regime in Iran, because it knew it had no legitimacy within the country. It didn't have support of its people. And so it created a framework outside of Iran through creation of terrorist organizations and proxies across the region so that it could essentially handcuff foreign policy of Western nations. A second thing is that, as you mentioned in your intro, the global community, Western nations, have bought into the process as if the regime in Iran is reformable. So our Western decision-making has been aimed at changing the Ayatollah's behavior to what we consider powerful and moderate.
Why have we failed to challenge them?
Excellent. Well, the first strategic framework the regime is built, meaning blackmailing the free world by terrorism, has worked. It has really created a significant amount of hesitation for the free world to confront Iran.
And now with nuclear weapons, right?
That is correct. But the fundamental reason is that we have not, as of right now, as the U.S. policy has not accepted the framework that the people of Iran don't want this regime. In other words, on the one, there is a contrast between what the international community thinks is happening inside Iran, whereas what the people of Iran are telling us is happening. In other words, the people of Iran have been dying at the highest per capita execution rate in the world. I just used last year's number, 2023. Iran executed north of 850 people, publicly, in other words, acknowledged executions. That is 74% of all global executions that were carried out. But Iran only has 1% of the global population. That speaks to a population that is trying to overthrow the regime, but it's got an enormous headwind. The headwind is the international community continuing to engage the regime. Yes, there is also a headwind of the regime killing and persecuting the Iranian people. But if we remove that, if we remove the first one, which is the international community finally making the decision to say goodbye to this regime diplomatically, to actually put pressure on the regime that matters, to hold its leaders accountable for rights violations and terrorism, truly hold them accountable.
Still ahead, celebrating the father of modern Zionism and his journey to win leaders to his cause. One of the most studied and enigmatic figures from modern Israeli history is Theodor Herzl. Here's a look at some aspects of the founding of the Jewish state. Theodor Herzl didn't start out as a Zionist, but he became one as he saw how Jews were marginalized in European culture. It fueled his drive to see Jewish people living in their own country. He aligned himself with important people who could move Zionism forward. What's interesting is who he didn't align himself with. Religious Jews or Christian Zionists. I spoke with author and early Zionism expert Philip Earl Steele about Herzl's significance and how he sidestepped religious groups that ironically ended up playing an important role in Zionism after his death. Take a look.
Herzl is universally considered the father of Zionism, although there were many and important Zionists before him, going all the way back to the 1820s and 1830s. But Herzl outshone them all. He's fairly judged the father of Israel, the visionary of the state. He brought unprecedented attention to the cause and created sturdy structures that evolved into the modern Jewish state.
So Zionism started out, it's really a religious or a biblical idea, a messianic idea, the return to Zion, but then it became secularized. So exactly what was Herzl's own attitude toward religion?
Yeah, Herzl was a rather tangential Jew most of his life. I mean, his contacts were rather weak. He wasn't, attending temple or synagogue regularly with his parents as a boy. He went to a Protestant high school in Budapest, Hungary, where he spent the first 18 years of his life. Once his Zionist career began, though, once he gave up his hope, his faith in and assimilationism. He remained aloof, even allergic to religious ideas. Herzl also betrayed an allergy to religious thinking in the sense that he never pursued what we call today faith-based diplomacy. He never conducted any outreach toward evangelical Christians. I think the biggest example of how allergic he was to religious thinking, messianic thinking, all the more so, was that in 1903 he proposed Uganda as, in fact, it's modern Kenya today, but he proposed the Uganda solution. That is that a modern Israel should be established there, not in Eretz Israel.
So he had this blind spot. So how did Zionism kind of overcome this and go forward to move on and become the success of the founding of the State of Israel?
When we look at the trajectory of Zionist history, we see that Zionism made its most important leaps forward in partnership with evangelical Christians. And this was also the case after Herzl's death in 1904. What quickly happened following his death was that the Zionist movement began to evaporate, and apathy and otherwise tended to take over, and we're left looking at generals without armies on the eve of World War I. At that very point, however, several Zionist leaders, among them most importantly Nahum Sokolow and Chaim Weizmann, who later became president, and Rabbi Moses Gaster, a Romanian Jew who by this point was the Sephardic chief rabbi in Britain. These three men began to work closely with the British government of David Lloyd George. The foreign minister then was Balfour, Arthur Balfour, of the famous Balfour Declaration. Sure. And these men pursued the angle of Christian Zionism with men who were Christian Zionists in the British government. So this sort of cooperation, Christian, evangelical, this sort of cross-pollination, once again proved itself to be the key, and led all the way to statehood.
Philip Steele, thank you so much for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Great to be here, Julie. Thank you.
That's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And please continue to pray for the safety of IDF soldiers and all those caught in harm's way, and for the return of all the hostages. And remember, the God who watches over Israel and you and me neither slumbers nor sleeps. I'm Julie Stahl. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.